This is the Voice of Russia from London. Welcome to Telling It Like It Is, the show that looks at some of the week's main events and give them a bit of a spin, a push and a shove. My name is Alexander Nekrassov, and with me in the studio is Maggie Pagano, a writer for The Independent and Financial News, and on the line from New York is Jeffrey Robinson, a TV and radio commentator and a writer.
And shover.
And shover, okay. Today we start with the events in Hong Kong, where there are thousands of people on the streets demanding democracy, as they say. It's actually a first time ever in the history, I think, when people are actually protesting against prosperity and economic growth and demanding something they don't really know what they're actually demanding. So, Maggie.
Well, isn't that actually quite a positive move? Because it shows that, you know, that just having a good life it means that you do want the other civil liberties too. Having said that, apparently there is a lot of poverty there. So actually I think it's broader than that. And I know they've been called spoilt by some people, but I can understand.
But have you noticed some of them are 17-year-olds who, when asked, so what are you doing here? They're saying, well, it's cool, isn't it? It's cool to be there.
That's
so
like
let's face it, it's not exactly a sort of a movement of people who want democracy and freedom and a voice to be heard.
Oh, yes, it is. Yes,
it is. I think they're looking ahead and they see their compatriots in China and they don't want to live like that. So actually they're being quite thoughtful.
Well, they don't live like their compatriots in China. Okay, Jeffrey, you wanted to say something.
I deeply love Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong is one of the most wonderful places on the face of the earth. I adore being in Hong Kong. And you feel their pain when you understand that the Communist Chinese government imposes a leader on them. And they are not China. They are something completely different while still being China. And they live much, much, much better than the average person on the mainland. The way they're protesting, and they are serious about this, they want real change, and they've wanted it for quite a while. And I've spoken to a number of people in Hong Kong recently about it. The way they're protesting is in a way similar to the various Wall Street protests we had in New York last year and the year before. But it's even more peaceful and it's friendlier. And just as Wall Street, there's music and there are people sitting around laughing and talking. And they're not going to give up that easily. No. And it poses a real danger to the Hong Kong market because they're just going to sit there until something happens. And China can be very stubborn and sit there until something happens as well. And I think the Hong Kong markets are going to suffer because of it. But if you've never been to Hong Kong, it's got to be number one on your bucket list. It is absolutely the most wonderful place.
Well, I personally think that they're being guided by the so-called organizers who are much older than these guys and girls. And
well, the 17-year-olds are sure, but the organizers are 22 and 24. And these are young people saying,
Martin
we know
Lee.
how the other half lives, and we don't want to live like that other half. We want to live like they do in the West with democracy.
Okay, all right. But the funny thing is that Britain and America have been expressing their concerns over what was going on, even though there is no crackdown, there is nothing going on there like that. And the funny thing, obviously, was that Nick Clegg, who was sitting in instead of for David Cameron while he was away on a conference in Birmingham, summoned the ambassador, summoned the Chinese ambassador, and said to him,
brave, actually.
You watch it, fella. And there was a joke immediately on the Russian media saying, how about the Prime Minister Medvedev summoning the British ambassador and saying to him, you guys, what about those gangs of men raping those kids? Yeah. And I mean, it's not a nice joke, but it sort of says that maybe Britain should not be interfering at this moment.
Well, Britain should be interfering, and so should the United States to make sure this does not turn into Tiananmen Square.
And actually, you could say it's not interfering because, I mean, it was a co-partnership, wasn't it? Britain was part of this deal. And I heard the leader of the Democratic Party last night, Martin Lee, I think his name, is saying we want Britain to interfere. You know, you're partly responsible for this.
The problem is that the Chinese are keeping to the schedule. Yeah. They are not actually breaking any rules. That's how it was how it was planned. And that is why this, in my opinion, I think it's a provocation. I think this is a typical classical provocation.
You understand that Chris Patton, who was the last governor of Hong Kong, is despised in Hong Kong.
Of course we understand. He's despised in Britain as well. So that's
for his role at the BBC.
So what's new? Okay, so let's move to another mess, which is in Iraq now. In Iraq, we have all these bombings, and guess what's happening? We have, 6-7 days of bombing, and ISIS are not just being pushed out, They're actually closing in on Baghdad. They have been recruiting even more people. They have successes in Syria and on the border with Turkey. And basically, it is telling us that Obama was not correct in his assumption that these bombings will help. So, Jeffrey, so how is the American public treating this?
We're getting a different side of that story. Apparently that they've been stopped before they got to the Turkish border, and they're starting to lose serious numbers through the bombing. The question is, what happens next? And I keep saying this. Where is the exit strategy? And that's the danger of this whole thing. The fact that, sure, you can put the drones up, and you can put the planes up, and you can have the Saudi prince flying one of those planes, and you can have a woman flying those planes, and you can bomb the hell out of it.
Well, it looks sexy. Come on, a woman, an attractive woman flying a jet fighter.
What happens next? How the hell do we get out of there? Now, boots on the ground, yeah, but they've got to be Arab boots. They can't possibly be British and American boots. That's a recipe for absolute and total disaster.
Maggie, do you think at some point they will be forced, and I'm talking about the West, to send in boots on the ground because the Arabs, Arab boots on the ground, they won't cope without the help?
I don't think that Western parliaments or British Parliament will let boots on the ground.
I agree.
I really don't, and I think we'll start having protests here. I think he just about got away with it last week. I think it has to be Arab boots. We might be there helping in the background, but it has to be Arab boots. Otherwise, the recruitment campaign for ISIS will just keep on going up. And that's what we're doing. We're helping them recruit right now.
Okay, but don't you think that if, God forbid, there is a terrorist attack on a target in London or in New York, Washington, whatever, don't you think that parliaments would change them? Jeffrey, do you think your Congress will change its mind if there is as I said, a God forbid, an attack on American soil?
The nature of this Congress, having been kidnapped by the right wing of the Republican Party, would simply blame it on Obama. Boots on the ground are not going to happen. They really are not going to happen because Maggie's right. No one's going to stand for it. They've got to be Arab boots. Now, from a strategic standpoint, you send in Arab troops with close air support from Britain and America. That's serious stuff. That close air support gives them a huge advantage because they control the skies, because ISIS doesn't have planes. But sending in American troops, no, I just don't see it.
Okay, guys, but there's one thing which is very weird, that the Obama administration has passed $500 million to the moderates, in inverted commas, among the Syrian opposition, and we might assume that at least half of that money will come to ISIS. And that's why I think there is a problem with the Western policy.
Switzerland.
There's a problem with Western policy is that you really have to decide what you are doing with Assad. You can't just continue this mess and think we're going to push Assad out, we're going to fund his opposition, and yet we'll continue to fight ISIS.
No, you can't. And I think, there have to be talks with Assad.
Exactly.
They have to go, they have to perhaps not apologize, but have to say, look, this conflict has changed and let's work on this together. And that's where you bring in the Russians and the Iranians.
Well, the Russians are already in, Maggie. They're already in. They have arranged this. The Syrians are sitting quietly. And believe me, the Russians, they actually prevented a much bigger mess by talking to the Syrians.
Maggie's right. The Russians and the Iranians.
Well, exactly. They need to be getting into this and not being pushed out of it, and Assad as well. But let's move now to David Cameron, of all people, in the Conservative Party conference, which ended this week in Birmingham. Now, this was a funny one, wasn't it, Maggie?
It's a funny one. And what's interesting about Cameron...
A bit reckless, wasn't it?
Very reckless and very paisley pyjamas.
All right. Well,
so you want to start
to
with
the pajamas, which Brooks Newmark wore, the minister who had to resign.
I have to say, I didn't like the way that he was set up in a sting. If this man had been, maybe we should explain, he was the minister who had to resign over...
For civil society, by the way. And who took part in the show several times.
I gather. He was probably quite a lively character. But if he'd been a sexual predator and there were sort of claims against this man, allegations, then maybe it was justified. But to set him up with a false woman...
Well, that was a male hack, freelancer from the Daily Mirror, who pretended...
No, from the Guido site. And he sold it.
Oh, to the Daily Mirror, yes.
And the Mail on Sunday turned it down, and so did the Daily Mirror, I believe.
And he pretended to be a Swedish model.
He pretended to be several
models. He used her image, yes.
And I think those women should sue the newspapers.
Well, I think they're thinking about it.
I think that's a real infringement.
That's what they're thinking about it, yes.
Outrageous, that's
Jeffrey, now you didn't hear about that scandal over there.
Yeah, we've had one of our own a couple of years ago. We had a congressman from New York, in fact, named Anthony Weiner, who in his spare time, and he was a good legislator, but in his spare time, he would take sexting pictures of himself and send them to women. And he got exposed.
So
Weird. Exposed doubly, I guess, and was forced to resign. His marriage was in serious jeopardy. In fact, his wife is a very close associate, a professional associate of Hillary Clinton. His marriage was in serious jeopardy. He said, I'm not doing it again. And then he got caught doing it again. He then ran for mayor of New York and lost handily. Well, handily is probably not the right word either. And the last anyone's heard of him, he's opening a restaurant in Brooklyn. Anthony Weiner is opening a restaurant in Brooklyn.
Yeah, but it might be a successful
Apparently,
venture.
Alexander, hot dogs are not on the menu.
Yeah, I was going to say Wiener sausages.
So we have also Mark Reckless, who defected to UKIP over the weekend.
What a great name.
Before the conference opened in Birmingham. So David Cameron really had a tough time. And he produced a very strange speech, didn't he, Maggie?
Can I just say, on Reckless, I and other UKIP defectors, I think the Tory party is taking the wrong approach. They should say, we're a party of debate. We love it when people disagree. That's what we are. And actually, if these people want to go up to UKIP, we're up for a good old debate and fight. Rather than this, dreadful man, he said lies.
Yeah, but that's the second one. You see, the problem is, Maggie, it's the second MP who defects. No, that's the problem. If it was only one, then they could have laughed it off. Now it's a problem, especially as Nigel Farage, is saying there's another one in the making. So they are nervous. Although, as I've always been saying, that Cameron will win the election. Yeah, there'll be another coalition. They can quiet down a bit. But
will those defectors get reelected?
I think Carswell in Clacton will in the by-election.
It's on the 9th of November.
Yeah, but he might lose it at the election. I do wonder, maybe they should stand aside completely and go for election. I'm not sure it's right that they can, go back.
Yeah, but they're doing a by-election. They're announcing a by-election. That's quite,
so it's,
decent of them.
But let's talk about Cameron's speech. I think the interesting thing about Cameron is he's very good when his back is to the wall. He knew this was, this is his election to lose.
Maggie, he was offering money he doesn't have. Did you notice that?
Yeah, I know, and I just wish he would offer us this money in 2015, not 2020. He's delaying it far too long. But, if he hadn't have done, then he could no longer claim to be the leader of a small state tax-cutting party. He had to do this. If there were no tax cuts
Unfortunately, when your country is bankrupt and you have a recession which you present as a recovery, this doesn't work. It's for people who don't understand. It's for people who don't know what is going on. But in connection to that, we have another interesting story to do with Wonga.com, the payday lender that was suddenly, all of a sudden, was told by the financial regulators to write off, 220 or something million in debts by the people who owe it. By the way, Wonga.com, Jeffrey, if you don't know, charges 6,000%.
Yes, I do know this story. I do know the story, and I did some digging into Wonga. Part of the problem is there is something called the usury law, which forbids this sort of thing.
No, it's not. The usury law had been banned
That's
centuries
right.
ago.
See, in New York, we have one. You couldn't do this in New York. In Britain, it was repealed in 1854. The thing is that Wonga, you say 6,000%. I actually found a much lower interest rate that they were charging. They were charging 365%. That's a point a day.
Right.
And I just want to point out one thing about the 365%. That's 7 times more than the mafia charges.
Yeah, well, that's how they are.
This is a mafia, isn't it?
It is a sort of a mafia. But, Maggie, the strange thing is how they took it on the chin.
I know, it's extraordinary, and you can only surmise that there's been a little bit of background playing
Well, they've already
ahead of
gotten
the
their
election.
capital back.
But
They've already gotten their layout back.
Well, of course they did, because they're astronomical. By the way, to remind listeners, the base rate in Britain is 0.5%, just to remind
and there are credit card companies that are charging 19%.
And the drug dealers in Brixton charge 1,000%. So there you have it, yes.
And the mafia is a point a week, that's all.
Yeah, but I do think, actually, what they should do is follow this up, and it should be illegal again.
It should be legal, and those people should be thrown in jail.
Yeah, I agree. Jeffrey, what's the limit in the U.S. then on the Usury Act? What is the maximum interest rate?
It depends. Each state's got it, and it may go up as high as 30. But
but that's... we should have similar credit regulations.
This is the Voice of Russia from London. Welcome to Telling It Like It Is. My name is Alexander Nekrassov, and with me in the studio is Maggie Pagano, a writer for The Independent and Financial News. And on the line from New York is Jeffrey Robinson, a TV and radio commentator and a writer. Now, on the same subject, roughly the same subject, talking about criminals and proceeds from crime, we have the Office of National Statistics in Britain, that fine body of men and women who are paid by the government, by the way, coming up with an astonishing calculation figures that in Britain, between 1997 and 2013, 11.1 billion pounds a year have been spent on dope and on prostitution. Now, the reason I suspect why these figures have come up is because there is an idea in Europe to include these figures into the overall GDP figures. Now, Maggie, tell me, what do you think about this?
I'm surprised it's so low, actually. I would have thought it'd be...
Okay. That's good.
Or maybe, actually, it's far more malevolent than that, and they want to start taxing it, you know?
But
they want to see it. Imagine
this is per annum, by the way. This is not from
per
97.
annum. Okay, that's...
No, that's a very solid, good performance, by the way, by the two industries, prostitution and drug dealing.
So what is that, 10%?
And it can only go up, by the way.
That's 10%, isn't it? 100 trillion? I'm just saying, what is our current balance of payments?
Well, they haven't yet included it into this
but I'm
GDP.
working it out
They're playing with it. Jeffrey, what's in America? Are they doing the same? Are they going to do the same?
Well, you know, I've written a lot about money laundering. And money laundering, when you talk about the dirty money, it's mostly corruption, political and corporate corruption, but it's also largely drug money and tax evasion, things like that. And that accounts for 2 to 4% of global GDP. This is a big number.
Jeffrey, I thought that bribery or loan to officials in America is about 1 trillion a year, no?
No, it's not that. It's not quite that much. The figures, including political and corporate corruption and drugs and tax evasion, are somewhere between 1 and 3 trillion. But it does account for 2 to 4% of the world GDP, and that's a huge amount of untaxed and basically hidden money that becomes a power in the shadows and is very dangerous.
There's another sector here that some businessmen have been talking about, and they call it the purple economy. And this is not direct criminality, but it's what's called bartering. So somebody arranges to have your tyres taken off your car, okay?
I see.
And then they're sold on.
It's a purple economy.
Yeah, purple economy, and the estimates
it reminds me of
that's
Prince,
10%.
the superstar Prince.
Call it the purple prince.
Purple economy. By the way, the loan sharking, which we were talking about, is a way of laundering money. I forgot to mention it before, but when you charge people 6,000%, that's called money laundering. Yeah. And if you
you got to go back, because the problem with that is, yes, you can loan out the cash, but then you end up getting cash back. So it doesn't really accomplish it.
No, it does.
What's more interesting, for instance, with the lotto, if you are a money launderer and you can find somebody who just won £1 million on the lotto,
but that's complicated, Jeffrey. That's complicated.
You're going to end up paying tax on this. I'm going to give you £700,000 cash. You give me your ticket, and then they go and collect the ticket and say, "Well, the money we won on the lotto." That's laundering.
Jeffrey, that's difficult. But talking about the waste of money, NATO's new Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has given his first press conference in Brussels, and he basically said that he is going to try to develop ties with Russia, but it has to change its behavior in Ukraine. And he was talking about NATO being strong and NATO moving eastwards, and it doesn't really mean, he said, it has got anything to do with putting Russia in any danger and so on. Now, Maggie, you've met the man.
I have.
And he was a former Norwegian PM.
He was a Norwegian Prime Minister for 3 terms and highly respected.
Right.
And during that period, he had very, very good relationships with Russia, particularly up in the north where the borders meet, up in Kirkenes, and obviously all the oil disputes in the Barents Sea. And I think they agreed all sorts of things, visa-less borders and so forth. So his past record, I think, is in his favour. He's a man who's acted with great dignity, if you remember, over the terrible shooting of the 70 children in Norway a few years ago.
Right.
And actually his reaction to that was, we want more democracy, more transparency. So, this is a man who has very firm principles, and he knows, because he is up there in the northern bloc, that we have to work closely with Russia. So I think this is great news for NATO.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's better than his predecessors, certainly. Well, it must be if they want to have closer ties.
Jeffrey, what do Americans actually think about NATO these days? I mean, do they actually accept the fact that NATO is a Cold War machine, instrument? and that it's
Well, I
still
think-
there, and it's actually getting closer to the Russian borders. Do they understand that Russia is not happy with NATO?
Well, you look at Mr. Putin's body language, it leaves no doubt. America looks at NATO, yes, as a Cold War instrument. And the appointment of a Norwegian is so good because one of the things that Norway exports very well is diplomacy. Everybody Norway's like Canada. Everybody loves Canadians because why not? And everybody loves Norwegians because why not? They're very good at what they do, and they do it in very charming ways. The only thing about Norway is in February it gets a little chilly.
Yes, well, let's hope that Mr. Stoltenberg realizes, of course, that he is upsetting the Russians, and it's never a good idea.
I don't think he will upset them.
Why is he
I don't think he
upsetting
will
them?
upset them.
Well, because they're moving closer to the Russian borders, and that's never a good idea.
But that's
it's never a good idea.
what are you suggesting if Ukraine were allowed to be a member?
Well, that's what they want to do, by the way.
Yeah,
They want to drag Ukraine into
Yeah.
NATO. That's the whole game. But let's move to another subject now, the scandal surrounding the intruder in the White House. Now, Jeffrey, I can see you trembling with excitement there in New York, because it's getting really serious now, isn't it? Because the head of the Secret Service suddenly had to stand down, probably pushed rather than just honorable.
No. She had to go because she was incompetent. And it was brought out in the hearings on the Hill
She worked
yesterday.
for 30 years there, if I'm not mistaken. So
Well,
she
let
was,
me tell you the
all that
story
year,
because I'm
time
very
she was
familiar with the
incompetent.
story.
Okay.
Let me tell you the story. The key moment in this whole story is the fact that when Oscar Gonzalez jumped the fence, he got on the lawn. He wasn't shot because the president was not there. There was no immediate danger to the president. But where were the dogs? Where were the guards? Where was the guard on the North Portico door? And why was that door unlocked? That door unlocked is the key to the whole thing, because you go back 15 years and what you find is a gradual diminution of the powers of the Secret Service vis-a-vis the White House staff. White House staff is always looking for optics. The Secret Service has always wanted to cocoon the president. So there's a conflict there. All of my friends who were Reagan's guys had a very strict policy of proximity and intensity and attention to detail. That's been lost. You look at George Bush landing on the USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier. Remember the mission accomplished thing? That was a stupid stunt for optics. The Secret Service not only objected to it, but then went along with it, and there were no resignations at that point. The Reagan people think that Bush Secret Service bunch should have resigned. You look at things like the shoe incident in Iraq when they threw a shoe at Bush. There were no Secret Service agents anywhere near him. You look at Obama today doing rope lines. There are no Secret Service agents.
Jeffrey, let me tell you a secret. Since Bill Clinton, there's always a door open in the White House for certain ladies of the night to come in. And it's actually since Kennedy, I think, that was going on.
They were not ladies of the night. There were other people. But
actresses.
That's
Okay, we'll call them actresses.
That's not the same thing as that North Portico door being unlocked. The fact is, the Secret Service has lessened proximity and lessened intensity and stopped paying attention to details. Not only has that woman gone, Julia gone, but the rest of the senior management should go. They're bringing in a guy who hopefully will go back to
they're
what
going to
Reagan
shoot all
people
the trespassers now. But Maggie, in Britain, it's all a laid-back approach, isn't it, to security of the top people?
Yeah, I think it's invisible rather than not there, don't you think?
There's only a few of them around, and they look like laid back. And
Well,
some of the ministers walk from their departments to Westminster.
A few do. Most of them still
with the
go
red
by
boxes
car.
and accompanied by the private secretaries. And there are, well, I don't know, maybe they're hiding the snipers
I think
everywhere.
they're hiding. I think
You think
there's
so?
more. Yeah, I do. I think
Okay.
there's much
Well,
more
they're
than we think.
protective. They're special branch. They're not a protective service. It's a very different mentality with the president.
Okay, so we moved to California, of all places, and it's the first ever state that has introduced statewide legislation which is banning single-use plastic bags. So now, as I understand, people will get busted if they will demand a plastic bag in
It's the
shops.
latest.
So, Maggie,
Latest
what
crime.
would you suggest to people there in California?
Well, I think if you don't want plastic bags, it's the only way of doing it. Trying to make you buy these heavier ones as we have here in Waitrose or W.H. Smith charge you a penny. It doesn't work.
Five
so it's got to be
pence.
zero tolerance.
5
Zero
pence.
tolerance. And it means you start bringing back baskets or shop more online.
I see. Jeffrey, are you going to suffer? Or
Well,
your friends
no, not at all,
in
because
California?
I like the old-fashioned paper bag. I mean, I think those are wonderful. Interestingly enough, California, of course, is the state where that would happen, and it will eventually move eastward, and we'll probably do it in New York. But what the Canadians had a thing in Montreal some years ago. They got angry about plastic. And they also got angry about separating garbage into paper and recyclables and plastics and whatnot. And they passed a law in Montreal with different colored garbage bags where you absolutely had to, at risk of a fine, separate your garbage into blue bags, red bags, green bags. It got very confusing, but it worked.
Talking about paper, we have a revolution in Britain. As of the 1st of October, there will no longer will be tax road discs in cars. Now, the confusion was such when it was announced that there were 300,000 calls from people asking, what do we do now? How do we get a tax disc now? And Maggie, do you sense that there's been a rip-off there somewhere?
I think there's definitely a rip-off, isn't there? Because cars that have been sold with the old car discs, they've got car discs, they've now got to register. So there are a lot of people have been paying double. So, of course, there's always an excuse to make money. I rather like those old paper little discs, actually. I thought they were quite sweet.
But the beauty, of course, is you understand that you buy a second-hand car, and the disc still lasts, for example, 6 or 8 months.
That's what I'm saying.
Now still have to register
you still
and pay,
have to register.
because that just sort of goes out of the...
Yeah.
But don't you think this was the main idea behind it? Because they claim it's all about administration. They're saving on administration.
How much money would you make by that? I don't think they're probably that smart, actually. No, I think it's probably just fairly
Jeffrey, in
incompetent.
America, do you have tax discs in cars?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, but they're generally put onto the license plate. So it's a little tag on the license plate. But I mean, when I lived in Britain, I don't understand why they're changing it. Because after all, they need that one person in the City Hall subsidiary office to stay employed, so that one person can handle the 52,000 people standing online on any given Tuesday to get their tax disc.
Well, they say they will save actually £7 million a year on administration costs, allegedly. I still think it's all about ripping off the people, because it makes they will make so much money on these re-registrations. And of course,
what about wasting those 4 hours at the tax office? What are we supposed to do instead?
Now, the last item we have is that Virgin Media has asked Ofcom, the communications regulator, to investigate the way Premier League sells its TV rights to the companies. And the word on the ground is that Ofcom is thinking about it. It's thinking about it. It doesn't really know what it's going to do. But these cynics are saying it's like asking somebody to investigate the mob and ask them how they spend the money, which they hard-earned money.
Yeah.
Maggie, what do you think? Will it end in just the Ofcom people saying, no, sorry, we can't do this?
I think they probably will have to have some sort of, superficial inquiry, and they'll say it's all absolutely fine. But actually, I think it probably does deserve investigation, doesn't it? Because it's clearly whoever has the biggest amount of money gets the Premier.
Well, the Premiership League, unfortunately, has become a money spinning operation. Unfortunately, as well, the fans pay for it because the tickets are going up every year.
No,
I know this because my son is a football supporter, so he paid 1,200 for the previous year. It's 1,450.
Is that for
That's
membership?
A season
It's
ticket.
outrageous.
Yes. So,
compared to Germany, where it's like £20 per game.
Can you imagine a situation, Jeffrey, in America that
the NFL.
Your baseball teams or football teams would be investigated how they use the money that they get from TV broadcasting?
Well, no, we have. First of all, the NFL is a huge industry, just as the Premiership is, and so is MLB, professional baseball. What they do to avoid those ticket prices, they have salary caps, and that is something that the players don't like, but the management does. In the meantime, the television rights get sold, and I'm happy to say, because we do follow soccer in England, I'm happy to say that whereas you get blacked out on Saturday afternoons at 3:00, we get in New York all of the 3:00 games. Every single one of them.
Okay, guys, well, that's all the time we have this week. And my thanks to Maggie Pagano in London here and to Jeffrey Robinson in New York. And you've been
always a pleasure, my friend.
And you've been listening to Telling It Like It Is on the Voice of Russia from London.